Ordo Templi Orientis Phenomenon, a personal account of sexual harassment. From foolsthatmenadore.wordpress.com. This was necessary to post after a discussion some sister radical feminists and I had about how male-authored writings on the mob mentality of aggression, dogmatic thinking, conformism, victim blaming, projection, exclusion, and so on fail to recognize that it is in fact a gendered issue. Even criticisms against religious family values, which are really patriarchal values, reduce the issue to mob mentality, variance being the herd or hive mind. If you have read other posts on this site, you will see the connection with the spermognostic view and with misogyny reducing women to nothing more than helpmates or vessels whose only usefulness is to sacrifice themselves for men's progress in evolution, power, and status. As you know, one of the purposes of this site is to bring attention to the sexual harassment and victim blaming by male Thelemites. And the more I read of other women's accounts, the more I see a pattern emerging with these practices. So stories like hers are really needed. Ordo Templi Orientis Phenomenon, a personal account of sexual harassment. By Soror Bishtar. Do what thou wilt shalt be the whole of the law. This article was written from the perspective of one female Thelemite. It was written within a specific framework which does not particularly evoke sympathy. I wrote this article because I believe that by doing so, I may encourage others who have been in a situation similar to mine to come forth. My aim here is to expose one personal scenario which exemplifies the misogynistic rhetoric inherent in the discourse and actions of the so-called leaders and players within the current OTO. The objective here is not to attract attention to any particular individual, but rather to suggest that there is an inherent tendency towards a male superiority within the OTO and other such Masonic-type orders. This tendency cannot be examined as an isolated entity, but needs to be briefly deconstructed from its historical antecedents. The OTO claims to have derived some of its Western mysteries and teachings from the Masonry and the Order of the Templars. Both the Masonry as well as the Order of Knights Templar had unquestionably significant impact during the Virgo-Pisces era. Both also, as many other institutions during the Old Aeon, naturally adopted the policy of excluding women. The Order of the Knights Templar, for example, was only open to men. Wives of men who joined the Templar order were expected to join other religious orders as nuns. Templars were forbidden to kiss their mothers, wives, sisters, or any women. The Masonry, up until today, does not accept women into its ranks, although there are Reformed Masonry lodges which have special chapters for women, wives, etc. Primitive human tribes' beliefs in women's erratic nature were based upon a fear of women's menstruation, its relation to the cycles of the moon, and consequently, its powerful and destructive effect upon men. This primitive fear of women led many tribes to isolate women from common tribal rituals. The perpetuation of this primitive belief was conveniently revived during the Virgo-Pisces era, when a woman's nature was believed to be too erratic, changeable, and fickle to be relied upon, especially for trusting the most guarded secrets. This myth kept women from being accepted into secret societies, which had begun to spring in Europe at around the time of the Renaissance. Insofar as the OTO is concerned, from the days of Theodore Royce's to Crowley's until today, we notice that very few efforts have been made to dispel this inherent myth. Instead of a progressive approach towards attaining the goal of merging the male-female element as prescribed in Liber All, several operative OTOs continue to relegate women to secondary or lesser roles, thus perpetuating the myths of misogyny and male superiority. My own personal account reflects this unchanged attitude. As a disclaimer, I would like to state that any similarities, apparent accusations to individuals will either be a result of self-identification or mere coincidence. Since the early days of the OTO, the position of women within the order has been predominantly a passive one. The most glaring example is that of the role of the priestess within the Gnostic Mass. Female names of Gnostic saints are stripped from the canon of the exclusively male pantheon. Though it is true that some Thelemic outer orders have attempted to revise this list to include female names. However, this does not seem to have yet become official or accepted. Crowley, insofar as several of his assertions regarding the female gender in form, lived up to the writing standards of his time. The language factor here is inclusive, as the reference to man as the universal being was and still is common and accepted language usage. But some of Crowley's own writings certainly are tainted with an inherent misogynistic view of the female gender and the superiority of the male formula over the female. These are also surprisingly representative of the historical and social circumstances under which Crowley was writing, and probably include the Freudian factor, that is, Crowley's hatred of his own mother. There are undoubtedly, on the one hand, magical reasons which are beyond my understanding that might have led Crowley to exclude the female element from one OTO grade. The 11th degree, of course. There are, however, historical antecedents of the OTO which might have influenced Crowley to leave women excluded from grades, or their limited or passive collaboration within certain rituals simply untouched. It is known to all that before his death, Crowley urged Germer of the many reforms that needed to take place within the OTO. Ironically, within a social context since the advent of the new eon, that is, within just about 100 years, women have made unprecedented advances in human society, most glaringly in the West. These first 100 years of the new eon have witnessed the breaking of the chains that had kept women in slavery. As said in Liber Al 2:45, quote, "I will fill her up with joy. With my force shall she see and strike at the worship of Nu. She shall achieve Hadit." Close quote. Some might question then why women have not yet played a significant primary role within the Lema. The misogynist might even argue in response to that women are not evolved enough to understand thelema, or that their reproductive apparatus renders them inferior due to the reproductive burden of their sexual organs, or due to their lack of a penis. But this simplistic mindset does not explain why some women willingly choose not to reproduce or choose to play the role of the male, either through manifest homosexuality, socially or magically. Young women who come into contact with thelema today have to deal with several obstacles, namely a lack of more specific data and anecdotal female initiatic experiences, including experiences related to the 9th grade, its operation, and its perspective from the female operator. The inherent sexism within Crowley's writings, and, the most importantly, a certain abuse of power by certain males within the OTO. This abuse of power appears to be in absolute contradiction with the tenet, every man and every woman is a star, which strikes a chord in the heart of every woman who comes into contact with the Lema. This abuse of power also indicates that the OTO is not exempt from the type of abuse that occurs within other mundane organizations. On the contrary, the OTO could provide a fertile ground for insecure boys or sick old men. These unfit individuals tend to overtly diminish the importance of female members within their chapters or lodges, or if their importance is at all acknowledged, it is often through their objectification, either through initiatory sexual rituals or other such favors. It is hard for a female Thelemite to admit to this, but there is nothing very impressive about the diaries of some of Crowley's Scarlet Women. I have found through the diaries that I have read that they were very shallow, containing mostly accounts of what Aleister Crowley did during a certain period of time. At best, they related some attempts at practicing the seventh degree operation, but nothing is recorded with scientific consistency. Many times I have questioned whether SW's Scarlet Women's statuses were given as honorary to those women while they were in service of the order. Nevertheless, there are indeed several female Thelemites who have made a contribution to Thelema. Jane Wolfe is definitely one very important example, a woman who is not feminine looking enough to fit within the standards of a lodge goddess. However, there aren't enough documents circulating that speak of her experience as a female Thelemite that could assist many of us females who are in the path. Consequently, there is a pressing need to deconstruct the myths that have been created over time about the role of females within the OTO, if we are to attract more females into our hordes, especially intelligent ones. Sadly, this myth has been consistently reinforced by certain unscrupulous male members of the order who have been given power too fast without greater scrutiny, and have consequently abused it. Not to say that there aren't enough thelemic males who have understood and acknowledged through their writing, their work, and through the virtue of their initiatic influence the importance of reforming the inherent sexism within the OTO. These men have had the courage to promote women, to empower female members by letting them play active key leadership roles within their order. Having established the above as the framework to my own personal account, I would like to begin by telling you that I came into contact with Thelema when I was a college student at age 18. At that time, I became interested in joining the OTO. One local fellow who was an OTO member told me that the OTO was only for men. He went into great lengths to explain the symbolic representation of the OTO letters, their relationship with the phallic male genitalia, and blah, blah, blah. I was rather bored by his lecture, which seemed restrictive. However, I had to acquiesce with his glass ceiling policy until another contact would later surface. Some years later, I came into contact with a certain O.T.O member who held a key authority post locally. This member was also known for his writings, many of which featured pictorial renditions of the female genitalia and other portrayals of the female body in a very passive way. When I first saw such pamphlets, I questioned him directly about his depictions of the female body, as well as his overemphasizing on passive female nudity to illustrate his writings. On that occasion, I candidly told him that I found it unnecessary the overuse of such imagery, since it had no context within his writings. I also asked him why, if he was so adamant about including nudity, wouldn't he include nude males as well? He told me at that time that these were mere artistic renditions and that they represented his love and worship of the goddess. I tried not to emphasize much on this and focused on trying to understand him within the context of his older generation. However, I found that this tendency has become symptomatic in that the mostly young male members of his lodge were abusing of this imagery. Nevertheless, I tried to keep the focus on advancing the order. At one point, given my dedication and contributions to his order, this high-ranking member gave me a high grade within his O.T.O. Some years passed by, and this high-ranking member kept treating me as the lodge prima donna. He would not give me any meaningful work to do, and several of his interactions with me were very superficial. Many times I asked him a serious question pertaining to rituals, and his response would be, "Don't worry, you're already a goddess." Goddess of what? I asked him. He seemed to imply that because I was a woman, young, and had a vagina, I was naturally initiated. I refused to believe in that, but continued to work for the order for one single reason. I wanted to make a contribution to the lineage of the founder of this order. Many women might fall into the trap of being treated as naturally initiated. This assumption represents, on the contrary of a privilege, a trap in the sense that your female physiology makes you initiated since you bleed monthly, you reproduce, etc. The flip side of this assumption is that women are not allowed to do certain things. Soon after I received the high grade nomination, I learned that one of the lodge masters was giving first degree grade initiation to female candidates through a sexual act. In other words, any females wishing to enter his lodge had to simply have the courage to strip themselves in front of all the mostly male members of the order and let the lodge master penetrate within. This was apparently the prerequisite for receiving the first degree grade. I brought this issue up to the attention of the high-ranking member. His response to me was that I had become too serious. I dismissed his comments, and at that point I knew there was no much I could learn from him and his O.T.O. At that time, several members exchanged correspondence within themselves to the extent that they thought there might be something wrong with the abuse of such sexual initiations by the lodge master. I collected details from many of these correspondences and started writing a detailed report. Sadly, most of the female initiates would join the order and leave shortly afterwards. The high-ranking member was aware that, while I was affiliated with his O.T.O, I had been in different relationships and at one point become involved with one Thelemite. A couple of months later, after my relationship began with this one Thelemite, the high-ranking O.T.O member called for a national meeting of all lodges. There would be some initiations, readings, and one big luncheon. This was taking place at a hotel in a city in the mountains. I was in touch with the organizers by email, who notified me of a date and place for the event. Prior to the event, the high-ranking member told me how excited he was that I would be participating in the event. However, I did not tell him until later on that my partner would be coming along. My intention was to introduce both men in person, since they had already contemplated creating a formal tie between their orders. After I notified him that my partner would be coming along to the national meeting, I did not hear back from him again. I waited until the day of the meeting to confront him in person. Upon my arrival, assuming everything was still on, I contacted the local lodge master to get driving directions to the meeting location. He told me by phone that the meeting had been canceled by the high-ranking member. I asked him why, and he said, "I can't explain to you over the phone. We must meet in person." Thus, I invited him and 4 other members of the O.T.O for lunch. During lunch, they narrated what the grand initiation plan of his master was. It involved, among other things, presenting me to the other members of the order as his Scarlet Woman and possibly performing a 9th degree grade initiation for the entertainment of the group. Since I had come accompanied with my partner, the operation was canceled, and so was the important national meeting. As one would conclude, from that day on, my contact with this high-ranking member and his O.T.O was severed. I wrote him a long letter immediately after the event expressing my outrage. I never received an answer to it. Many years have passed, and as far as I have been informed, things have not changed within his domain. Even though lodge masters have resigned and the new blood has come in, the basic concept of forceful sexual first-degree grade initiation, I believe, still persists. By now, I am no longer his sought-after Scarlet Woman. Others might have come and filled up the post, as they always will. Maybe they will be bitchier than I was and bite his penis off. Love is the law. Love under will. One response to the article. McBain says, "This is extremely concerning.